Hello, friends. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Today I want to share with you some knowledge to help you understand biblical prophecies. One reason Bible prophecies, such as those found in Revelation, can be difficult to understand is because the prophesied events are not necessarily written in chronological order. What I mean is that some prophecies have already come to pass, and these are often blended into prophecies that have not happened yet. I'm going to explain this in a moment, but first I want to point out that some Bible prophecies have only recently occurred. For example, the reestablishment of Israel as a nation in 1948. Also, many Jewish people have moved to Israel since its reestablishment, and many are moving there still. These events were prophesied by Ezekiel in chapter 37, verse 21. Did you know that the Hebrew language completely disappeared? Although the language was considered extinct, it is currently being restored, as was prophesied by Zephaniah in chapter 3, verse 9. The shekel was restored as Israel's national currency in 1980. This was prophesied by Ezekiel in chapter 45, verse 12. More recently, in 2017, Jerusalem was once again recognized as the capital of Israel. It's important to understand that for nearly 2,000 years, Christian pastors and theologians have debated whether these prophecies about Israel were merely symbolic or meant to be taken literally. Even just 100 years ago, most people thought these prophecies were not meant to be taken literally. Many people are asking the same question today. Are Bible prophecies about the future meant to be taken literally or symbolically? I believe these prophecies will come to pass in a literal sense. For example, a third temple will be built in Jerusalem. I will explain this and other prophecies about the future in other videos. For now, the point that I want to make is Bible prophecies are written in such a way that they go back and forth in time, and this makes understanding them a little more challenging. Therefore, it's necessary to sort out what has already happened and separate those verses from the verses about what will happen in the future. Let me give you an example. When you read the book of Daniel, you will find that in chapter 8, the prophecies include things which have happened already and things that are yet to occur. Then in chapter 9, the pattern repeats. The same thing happens in chapter 10 and again in chapter 11. This happens in the New Testament as well, but I will talk about that in another video. Let me show you an example of some prophecies which have already come to pass. Jesus mentioned Daniel prominently when he was telling his disciples about future events. So I am going to use Daniel's prophecies in this illustration. Daniel was a Jewish man who lived in Babylon after Jerusalem was conquered and the first temple, Solomon's temple, was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. You probably know him best from the story of Daniel in the lion's den. This Daniel is the same Daniel who survived a night in the lion's den. Anyway, God gave Daniel the spiritual gift of having dreams and visions about the future. In addition to this gift, God also gave Daniel the ability to interpret dreams, including the dreams of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, whom Daniel served. You see, Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were taken captive from Israel. They were young people and former members of the Jewish upper class. King Nebuchadnezzar had them spend 3 years learning the language and customs of Babylon so that they could serve him in the royal court. When it came to Daniel's spiritual gifts, what would often happen is this. Daniel would pray for the understanding of a dream. Then in answer to his prayer, the angel Gabriel would be sent to explain the meaning of the dream to Daniel. I would like to read you a short example of one of Daniel's dreams. This is Daniel chapter 8, verse 3 through 8, and I'm reading from the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, which is the Old Testament. And I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the stream a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, and no beasts could stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and magnified himself. And as I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west over the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I saw standing before the stream, and ran at him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with anger against him, and smote the ram, and broke his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground, and trampled upon him. And there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. And the he-goat magnified himself exceedingly, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of it, there came up the appearance of 4 horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. End quote. So that was a part of one of Daniel's dream. And here is a snippet of the angel Gabriel explaining the dream to Daniel. This is Daniel chapter 8, verse 20 through 22, and I'm reading again from the Tanakh. Quote, "The ram which thou sawest having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia, and the rough he-goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. And as for that which was broken, in the place whereof 4 stood up, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not with his power." Okay, some important things here to learn from Gabriel's interpretation. Here, Gabriel explained that animals or beasts and their horns are symbols for kingdoms and kings. Let me read it again and see if you agree. Quote, "The ram which thou sawest having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia, and the rough he-goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. And as for that which was broken, in the place whereof 4 stood up, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not with his power." End quote. When it comes to interpreting this, there is general consensus among Bible commentators that the 2 horns represent King Cyaxares of Median and Cyrus the Great of Persia, and that the rough he-goat represents Alexander the Great. But that is where the consensus ends. I'm going to give you an explanation for the rest of this verse that I do not think anyone has suggested before. After describing the he-goat as the king of Greece, referring to Alexander the Great, Gabriel's interpretation continued. Quote, "And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. And as for that which was broken, in the place whereof 4 stood up, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not with his power." End quote. Here is the meaning of these verses. The ram, who was the king of Greece, Alexander the Great, died at age 32, and his kingdom was carved up and divided between his many generals. But it was the general Antigonus who became king of Macedonia, which is where Alexander was from. Macedonia is the largest Greek region. Antigonus was the first king of Macedonia after Alexander's death, and he was the first king of the Antigonid dynasty, which lasted for 140 years. Antigonus and his descendants ruled Macedonia until King Perseus, the last king of Macedonia, fulfilled the prophecy by becoming the horn that was broken, when he was defeated in 146 AD by the Romans, who abolished his kingdom. But then the verse continues, quote, "And as for that which was broken, in the place whereof 4 stood up, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not with his power," end quote. In other words, 4 new kingdoms will rise, but they will not get their power from the last king of Macedonia, the horn that was broken. Here is the meaning of this verse. As I explained, the last king of Macedonia, where Alexander the Great was from, was defeated by the Romans. It was then ruled by the Romans, who continued to conquer and absorb additional territories. Then, about 150 years after defeating the last king of Macedonia, the Roman Emperor Diocletian established a tetrarchy. The word tetrarchy is derived from the Greek word tetra, meaning 4, and arch, meaning rule. In other words, 4 rulers. You see, Diocletian divided his Roman Empire into 2 parts in 286 AD. He remained emperor in the east, but made Maximian emperor in the west. But then these 2 emperors divided their respective kingdoms in half again in 293 AD, appointing 2 more men to help them rule the Roman Empire: Galerius, who ruled in the east, and Constantius, who ruled in the west. So about 150 years after the last king of Macedonia, Greece, was defeated by the Romans, Rome was divided into 4 kingdoms, a tetrarchy, ruled by Diocletian, Maximian, Galerius, and Constantius. These are the 4 rulers that Daniel saw in his dream. The same story is repeated, but through a completely different dream in Daniel chapter 2. In chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream about an incredibly large statue, which contained 5 layers of different types of material, each layer representing a kingdom and a king, 5 kingdoms and kings in all. Daniel prayed to God and asked for the ability to understand the dream, and his prayer was answered. The first kingdom was symbolized as the golden head of the statue in Daniel chapter 2, verse 38, and it was Babylon, ruled by King Nebuchadnezzar. The second kingdom was Persia, and its ruler, Cyrus the Great, symbolized as the silver breast and arms of the statue in Daniel chapter 2, verse 39, the first half of that verse. The third kingdom was the empire of Alexander the Great, symbolized as the brass belly and thighs of the statue, Daniel chapter 2, verse 39, the second half of that verse. The fourth kingdom was Rome, in Daniel chapter 2, verse 40, symbolized as the iron legs of the statue. And finally, the fifth kingdom was a divided kingdom, the Roman Tetrarchy, symbolized as the feet and toes of the statue, made from a mixture of iron and clay, Daniel chapter 2, verse 41 through 43. This mixture of iron and clay would, of course, be brittle. Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, says of the fifth kingdom, quote, "And in the days of those kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed," end quote. And that is exactly what happened. One of the four emperors, Constantius, and his wife Helena became Christians. After Constantius died, his son, Constantine, conquered the other three members of the Tetrarchy and became sole emperor of Rome. Then he made Christianity legal and helped set up Christian traditions which remain to this day. It was Emperor Constantine who established the Council of Nicaea, which met in June and July of 325 AD. This council decided which books to include in the Bible. The council members decided on which day Easter should be celebrated, and they made decisions about many other Christian traditions as well. If you are curious, there is a book called Eusebius, Life of Constantine. It was written by Cameron and Hill. Eusebius, spelled Eusebius, was a Christian historian and a contemporary of Constantius and his son Constantine. Eusebius attended the Council of Nicaea and took copious notes during the meeting, which are recorded in his book, Life of Constantine. It was Constantine's mother, Helena, who is responsible for finding many of the relics that are still around today. Her son gave her the power of Rome's purse to find treasures such as the crown of thorns, which is in the Louvre Museum in Paris, and many other items considered sacred to Christians. She is credited with building the Church of the Nativity in Jerusalem and the Church of Eliana on the Mount of Olives, where Jesus ascended into heaven. But there is more. In his dream, Daniel saw a stone strike the feet of the statue, which shattered it into pieces. The angel Gabriel explained the vision to Daniel in chapter 2, verse 45. Quote, "For as much as thou sawest that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke into pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king that which shall come to pass hereafter. And the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure." End quote. This verse is packed with symbolic meaning that is important. Quote, "For as much as thou sawest that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands," end quote. In this sentence, the mountain is God the Father, and the stone is the Messiah, his only begotten Son, according to Psalm chapter 2, verse 7. Begotten and not made. In other words, cut out of the mountain without hands. This is the stone, the Messiah, Jesus, that the builders threw away in Psalms chapter 118, verse 22. The cornerstone described by Isaiah in chapter 28, verse 16. This same stone smashed the kingdoms of the world and established a heavenly kingdom that will never be destroyed, just as Daniel prophesied. A spiritual kingdom of Christians established for God, built on earth by the apostles and early church fathers, which has been handed down through the ages over 2,000 years to us. The reason I am sharing this with you is because I believe it is impossible to understand prophecies about the future if you cannot understand prophecies about things that have already happened. Many of the metaphors used in Revelation are defined in the Tanakh, the Old Testament. We've already defined several here. Although it is valid to take biblical prophecies literally, as I've described, it is also undeniable that prophecies also contain allegorical symbols, such as beasts, horns, mountains, and the stone. You cannot understand biblical prophecy without accepting both literal meanings and allegorical meanings. However, there is one condition: they cannot contradict one another. If they do, then something is wrong and our understanding of the truth is incomplete. God is not a God of confusion, and the Holy Spirit will lead us into all truth where there is no contradiction. I hope you found this helpful and that you learned something new and interesting about the Bible. If you like my video, please like and share it, and consider purchasing a copy of my book, The Prophecy Key: Enduring Tribulation and the Truth No One Will Tell You. God bless you and fill your spirit with peace. Take care.